Hey folks, welcome to your open discussion week. So this is meant to be a time where it's kind of the lightest peer review possible. So you're all having your minds, presumably, on the paper that you're writing that's due at the beginning of next week. It's kind of the wrap up to our unit on the Q. And so the prompt has been posted for a little bit now, so hopefully you've been ruminating just a little bit about it. The purpose of this week in your discussion sections is to talk just about where you are, what you're trying to work through, what maybe some concerns are you have, or just to throw something out there in hopes that somebody can help you talk it out or something like that. Okay, so it's incredibly open-ended. You can use the discussion posts however you want. I ask you this week to respond to others' posts as constructively as possible, right? So really try to be thoughtful, try to be constructive, help one another out because you're all in the same boat. I would like to say that I've talked to a number of you about your papers and I'm pretty excited to see where they go. Okay, a lot of you have really great ideas, you're going in cool directions. Yeah, so I will say that, but for this video at the beginning of this week, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. We're going to talk through the prompt just to kind of clarify some things. I know that it's hard to write a first paper in a class for a professor for the first time. So let's talk it out. Let's make sure it's clear. Yeah, so here we go. We're going to talk through the prompt. So I'm going to share my screen with the prompt that is posted. It's the last document in the whole Q module, right? So it's right at the bottom. The place that you upload your paper is the place that has this document in it. So that's where you can find it, okay? So here it is, the prompt, essay 1, the Q. The basic writing assignment is to write a full 3-page double-space essay where I want you to take a position on something that happens in the Q. So this is the big thing that your whole paper is going to go a bit wrong if you don't understand or if you're not pursuing. And so that's why I have these paragraphs here for what I mean about taking a position on this paper. In other words, what a thesis statement for this paper should look like. Okay, so the other parts of the writing assignment here, frame the issue so that readers can recognize where their attention should be focused, why this paper is interesting, basically. You also need to support it with evidence from the text. One of the key things for a paper of this length, it's 3 pages, right? So you might think, it's a lot shorter than my research papers. True. It's also longer than a reflection paper. True. That makes it kind of a difficult length to write in, actually. That makes organizing it really important. There's no part of it that can be extra, that can be just thoughts that you have about the paper that don't directly help you defend your thesis. So for this paper, one of the things that I really encourage you to do is to at the very least read over it and cut things out that aren't directly related to your thesis and make sure each paragraph has a topic sentence and that topic sentence relates to your thesis, and then every sentence in that paragraph helps support that point in your paragraph. Outlining for a 3-page paper is super helpful, okay? Personally, when I write a paper of this length, I might write it to figure out what in the world I'm thinking, right? And then figure out what actually that outline that I kind of just wrote on was, and then edit it to better fit that outline. Right, that's how important I think structure is, okay? If the audience can't tell what your outline is by reading it, that means it's blurry. That means it's hard to tell what your point is at any given time in the paper, okay? So that's what I mean by clearly organized, and that is a part of your grade. Okay, so the writing assignment up here includes everything you're gonna be graded on. All right, so that's why I'm spending some time up there on that paragraph. Now, what are you defending in this paper? What is your thesis statement? Here I want to draw a contrast, and this is the hardest thing often for students to get, especially writing about novels, okay? So here you're arguing something that you noticed in the text, but also saying why that's interesting, why it's important to notice that thing in the text, right? So you're not just saying, hey, Tarak is this kind of character. You're saying why it's interesting to notice that Tarak is that kind of character. So if you're like, no, Tarak is actually a jerk, okay? That takes some interpretation and some defense from the text, right? So it feels like a thesis statement. It would be a thesis statement if we were in a lit class, perhaps, right? But it's actually more kind of like a book report paper, and we want to go deeper. So if you're like, hey, Tarak actually isn't that moral a character, we need to go one step further for this paper, and you have to say what that does for the text or why it's interesting to note that. So an appropriate thesis statement for our paper, if that's what you want to focus on, would be something like, Tarak fails to meet like moral standards or something, basically like Tarak is a jerk. And that shows how difficult or what pressures the society is putting on even people who are in like healthcare positions or whose whole structure is meant to help or something like that, right? So it's something interesting. There's a reason to know, basically. There's a reason to know that Tarak is a jerk or Tarak fails to meet moral standards, right? So it's not just enough to note something about the text or like to see something interesting. You have to explain what it does to the structure of the text, to highlight something to the audience or something like that. So that's what I'm trying to highlight in this section that says 4 thesis statements. So I give a few examples here as well, right? So what I'm calling a subpar paper, right? A paper that's going to be docked for how well you structure the thesis statement would be something like Amani changes throughout the novel, right? That's something that you're noticing. That's cool. You're doing some interpretive work in order to notice something is the case, in order to be like, hey, I'm going to show you how Amani changes. Or, for example, another one, information plays different roles at different parts of the novel, right? So it's kind of, people are open a little more in the beginning. People are sharing stuff about themselves, you might say. But then it kind of becomes a little more dangerous to share something, like you might notice something about the power of information. Cool, you've done interpretive work. That's awesome. But the kind of thesis statements that we're looking for in this paper go a little bit further than that. It's saying, what does that highlight? What is that doing in the book? Okay, so I changed those theses to highlight what we're looking for, right? So the fact that Amani changes throughout the novel, okay, cool. But now you have to say why that's cool to notice. What does that show you as an audience, right? So in the first short stories part of our class, we tried to think about how elements of these stories did something, right? So the perspective of the author was active to the audience, right? So the first person perspective of Omelas by Le Guin, we could notice that. We could be like, hey, look, there's this perspective going on, but now we have to say, and that's interesting to know, why, right? So I talked a bit about it, you guys did in your reflections, right? The historical context of Utopia, right? We could write a paper just like, hey, Thomas More, here's the stuff you could note about him, but then say what we can learn from that about the text. That's the move I'd like us to make, right? So it's the first step here would be Amani changes throughout the novel, and you can track those changes. That's telling me, that's defending Amani changes, and you can tell me how Amani changes. But to make this a thesis for our paper, you have to say something like the changes Amani goes through in the novel, and then tell me what's interesting about that. You could say something like mirrors the way that something else changes in the novel, right? So you're showing me why it's interesting to know about Amani's changes. Okay, similarly with that information thesis, just noting and telling me about the changes is that first level, but we're going for a thesis that tells me why having this information change is an interesting facet of the novel. It relates to something else, it highlights something else, okay? So here's the quick thing that I say about this. The goal of your thesis statement is to use your observation about the book to make a claim about how it allows us to come to a deeper understanding of the novel, okay? And I think one of the reasons I'm spending so much time on this is I think this can be a hard thing to grasp, right? I think this is the most frequent way that students can kind of have a hard time just starting on a paper. You think you have a thesis statement and you're not quite sure if it goes that extra step. So let me know. I'm more than happy to work that through with you in the meetings that I've had so far. That's the kind of thing that frequently we're doing, right? We're trying to make sure we have a thesis statement that works. Okay, so let's just talk about what's going on with the deadlines for the paper. As you know, this week we have the open discussion that I mentioned. It's the standard weekly discussion structure, but you don't have extra reading. You're just trying to work on that paper, get some brainstorming going. Yeah, you have extra credit if you've met with me for office hours. A lot of you have already done that. A lot of you have signed up for meetings this week for Tuesday and Thursday. I mentioned in an announcement recently how you make those appointments. So hopefully that's a little more straightforward now. It's been a long time since the beginning of the semester, and now for those of you who have made an appointment, so I've reviewed how to do that. And the final paper, here we go, right? Remember, it's due by the end of the day, November 1st. And then I made the rest of that week really light. There's like a 2-page paper to read that week, right? It's election week, it's gonna be stressful as shit. Get your paper in, take a freaking breath, right? So contact me before then if there's problems with getting the paper in by November 1st, okay? All right, so how are you gonna be graded on this? These aspects are just a reflection of the qualities that I mentioned up there with the first paragraph of the paper assignment. So the biggest thing I'm gonna grade you on is, hey, do you have a thesis like we just mentioned, right? Does it not only notice something about the paper, but tell me how that's significant or interesting or worth writing a paper about? Does it show you something interesting about the book, right? And so that's part of this aspect. The other part is, does the rest of the paper actually target that thesis? Is it on topic throughout? Is it targeted at that thesis, okay? So that's the 2 bits that make up this chunk of your grade. 35%, is it a good thesis? Does the paper target it? Sweet. The next part, a quarter of your grade, comes from having a clear and logical organization. So I mentioned a bit why this is so important for this paper. It's the length. You have to be concise, and it's pretty easy to blur what the hell's going on. Like, for your audience, it has to be clear what your point is at every point in your paper. What this means in practice is your paragraphs need to be relatively short. It can't just be an ongoing reflection. It's easy to lose the point that you're talking about and ongoing stuff. If your paragraph is more than 2/3 of a page, you're making more than one point. And that hurts your paper because it means you're not giving your points enough time, right? You can't establish each point if you shove them into one paragraph. Believe me, I've done this a lot. So break it down, figure out what your 2 points are, at least 2 points if it's a really long paragraph, give them their own paragraphs. It gives you time to actually defend them, and it makes it clear because they get a thesis statement. So it's highlighting to the audience what your point is. That's my best advice for making sure you get a strong grade here for the clear and logical organization. It's a quarter of the grade for this paper. It's really important. Otherwise, I promise you it's going to be a less clear paper. So pay attention to what your paragraphs are. Paragraph, paragraph, paragraph. Think about it. Like, do it intentionally is what I mean by that. Okay, next thing, you're going to need evidence. You can have 2 ways of putting in evidence. One is paragraphing and then putting in a parenthetical where that happened, right? So you still need to cite your paraphrasing. The other is putting a quote in. I think a mix of those 2 things is appropriate in a paper of this length. Remember, when you quote, you did interpretive work for that. You can't assume your audience knows or is getting the same thing out of that quote as you did. So whenever you quote, have a sentence after that quote telling me what that quote meant. Okay, that's the responsible way to quote. And again, put a parenthetical about where that quote came. I'd be surprised if a paper of this length had more than like 3 or 4 pieces of evidence, parentheticals and quotes, in order to defend things. The 2 things I'm looking for in order to get satisfactory on this is, are your quotes relevant? Are they actually helping your thesis? And are they explained, like I just said with the quote aspect? Yeah. All right. And I give, for each of these you see I give a paragraph here. I'm just given, here is what I mean. Yeah, here's the short and sweet version. Finally, clarity. Here's what I mean by that. Is it consistent? Is it relevant wording, right? So if you're using a word that everybody wouldn't mean the same way, define that. No distracting mistakes in grammar and spelling. So I'm not like grading for it, but if it starts undermining, like if it makes the audience kind of like, what do you mean? That's when this grade starts being lowered, right? So when wording starts getting distracting, if you're using words in a kind of weird way, if sentence structure isn't clear, then it's clear you should have edited this. You should have had like read it aloud to a friend or even just to yourself. That cleans up so much. Believe me, my sentence construction, you might have noticed in like emails and announcements, can be a mess. It's not always clear. Read through it again. This is a paper. It's not just like a chat. That's 10% of your grade is clarity. Oops. This isn't the best way to scroll. Sorry. And then just additional requirements. Indicate in its title or heading which of these paper prompts you're answering. That's just really helpful for me. And then just make it reasonable, right? Don't try to cheat with a 3-pager thing by like moving margins around, using a weird ass font, using a weird size font. The 3 full pages is really indicating like the depth that I think you need to go into in order to satisfy this paper. You won't be satisfying. You won't be going into enough depth if you don't go at least like 2/3 onto the second page. It will be too superficial handling. You will have chosen the wrong thesis, or you won't have sufficiently defended it. If you go too far into the 4th page, I really think you haven't been concise enough. There's going to be extra stuff in there, so it needs to be edited down. Okay, so I'm not going to like downgrade you for like not being precisely 3 pages. I'm indicating what kind of paper I think this should be. All right, so I think a number of you are approaching this text in different ways. I think that's great. I think there are a number of different angles to find this text compelling. So I'm giving you 5 different prompts that you can answer. Yeah, so hopefully one of these you find interesting, or at the very least easier. Okay, those are my goals here. So pick a paper topic here. One of the things I just want to note is that I give you kind of an outline or standards for putting your papers together with each of these themes. So you're going to have like a topic paragraph and a conclusion paragraph, but the kind of things that I'm expecting you to have in your paper kind of give you a bit of an outline already. I'm trying to help here. So the first one is Amani. I think she becomes a pretty interesting character. She's one of our main characters, but as you finish the book, you see it's just like, wow, do changes happen with Amani, not happy ones. But this structure applies to each of them, and I give bullet points there, right? So your thesis is going to be that something happened in the book and it's interesting or significant in some way. Here's what the fact that this happened does, right? So in order to have a paper here, your thesis paragraph is just telling us about that. There's changes and it's interesting. Then you have to tell us just like what that interesting thing even means. What do you mean by that? Okay, so in this example with Amani, here's one sample thesis you might have about Amani. You don't have to have this particular thesis. I'm just using it as an example. So say you think her development over the novel shows how she symbolizes hope throughout the novel. So the amount of hope that there is for all of the characters, or just with the society in general, right? So say that's your thesis. Here's how the body of your paper should kind of go. First off, this first body paragraph, tell me what you think it would even mean to symbolize hope, right? That could mean a lot of different things to different people. So just explain what you mean. For any character to symbolize hope, you might tell me what you think hope means. Tell me what it means to symbolize hope, right? Just spend a paragraph explaining that to me, right? So explain what you mean when you say the significant part. It's just a quick paragraph. Then, because then explain the thing you're claiming happens in the book, right? So the second bullet point here, right? You're saying Amani's development over the novel symbolizes hope. So explain Amani's transitions over the novel. So in this case, because it's transitions, you might say, here's how Amani was in the beginning. Here's a transition. Here's how she was in the end. 3 paragraphs. Boom. Might have a paraphrase for one, a quote for another, a paraphrase for the other. Bam, bam, bam. 3 paragraphs. Then final body paragraph, connect them. Say how her transitions are or satisfy that definition of symbolizing hope up top. You got a paper, right? So similarly for these other prompts, right? For resistance, I'm asking you to tell me what role the resistance plays in the cue, and then tell me how your characterization of the resistance shows us something about the cue. Okay, and it's the same structure. Tell me about what you think, how you're using resistance, right? Because I tell you, you could focus on resistance that occurs, the lack of resistance, right? There's a number of different things you can do about resistance. But in this first paragraph, you have to tell me what you mean, right? We had a week where we talked about power, right? Resistance is a response to power. So there's some explanation there. You need to explain your approach in that first paragraph. Then talk about the instances of resistance that you take to relate to this and your interpretation of the events in the novel that you're going to be bringing in. Then you close with, here's how the events relate to what I take the issue of resistance to be, right? So that's the structure of that I think you could do with each of these papers. And remember that each paragraph should have a topic sentence. Every aspect of that paragraph should go towards that topic sentence. And that paragraph actually goes towards establishing a thesis, right? So it's very targeted, it's developed cleanly. There you go. So there's a theme of resistance you could write on. Another paper topic, you could talk about the cue in the novel. So you'd say, hey, here's how the cue, here's something I notice about the cue, and either how it develops in the novel, its role at a particular time in relation to something else, anything you want to say about the cue, an observation about the cue. And then tell me why observing that is cool. Tell me why observing that allows you to see something else in the book, observing that either could parallel a character's development, could highlight something about a character, right? So how does the cue's development show how Inez changes, right? I've seen a paper on that was pretty interesting. Personally, I think Inez is the most interesting character in the novel. BT does. Number 4 kind of connects to something that I've been trying to make us think about throughout the term so far. Think about something in the text that you think highlights the author doing something to the audience. So we haven't really talked about this so much in our discussion sections, but think about an aspect of the novel that might highlight an intentional thing the author's doing. Here are questions like, are there perspectives we're missing? Is there a way the author is presenting perspectives, is describing the society, right? Think about the ways that we've been taught. You could think back to the short stories we discussed and think about whether any of those methods are identifiable in this text. And then think about what that would mean or what you can draw from that, right? So basically the methods that we talked about explicitly at the beginning of the semester, can you apply them here? Okay. And then finally, this is a pretty interesting topic, but also it's kind of the most abstract. So it could be an interesting paper to talk about, or you could just be like, oh, I don't want to do that. That's fine, but it's the topic of health. I think this is a really interesting theme throughout the text. everybody kind of, from my perspective, relates to health in some ways, right? So I have some quotes. Helping the sick is subject to the law too. It wasn't just every man for himself. So Tarek says this towards the beginning when he recalls not taking the bullet out. So helping the sick has this interesting role, especially in this totalitarian society, right? So doctors have this role of taking care of people, of healing the sick, but are they able to play this role in the society? So here's a quote from Yeya's file where he's described thus. In addition to anxiety and irritability, other symptoms include an irrational belief that he can alter reality, a clear tendency to act in socially unacceptable and unhealthy manner, and a sharp, unfriendly manner when interacting with others. So I really like this quote because think about how many people we could describe that way, especially when put under political pressure, especially just as a member of a protest at all, right? Somebody who just is trying to stand up for themselves, right? But it's not described as personality traits or just an interaction with somebody who's expressing power. It's described pathologically. It's described as something that's diagnosable. So it enters into something where he's diagnosed as unhealthy. So some motivating questions to consider for the thesis could be, how do the mental and physical health of the characters mirror the health of society, right? So noting someone's ongoing health, like Yeya or Amani, or the health of Mabruk and her family, noting how those are happening in the society. Do those show anything either about each other, right? There's a number of different health things, like Tarek and his role in trying to care, or supposed to be trying to care. How does that, maybe noting something about that, either relate to each other or relate to the health of society or something like that? I think there are a lot of interesting theses there. What characters are characterized as ill or unhealthy? Are there people meant to help the ill? What is society's role in being responsible for helping the ill, right? Especially with Mabruk's trying to get help and Tarek's role of helping, and his nurses. How does responsibility for helping the ill get interpreted throughout the novel, right? There are a lot of people here. Does this change over the course of the book, right? In our ending, we do get a change here. How do you interpret the change in Tarek's role at the end? What do the health of the characters symbolize about the broader hopes, well-being, likely outcomes, or the role in relation to society? So that's one that I just really like thinking about. I rarely get students writing about that one, but it's something that I like thinking about. So you have these 5 prompts. If you want to write on something else, you need to talk to me, okay? Because then it especially gets difficult to have a thesis like I described up above, okay? All right, so this is a pretty long video this week, but I wanted to kind of talk through how I'm thinking about this prompt. I am just grading it according to these features, right? There'll be a rubric. You'll get a score for each of these. I'm calling them basic features, right? So is your thesis meeting you're telling me something significant, and is the paper all organized towards it, right? Just in these parentheses, I give you the 2 things I'm looking for each one. For the organization, are your paragraphs each just have 1 point each, and are they organized towards a thesis? For smooth organization, are all of your evidence, do you have evidence? Is it relevant? And do you explain what its role is in your defense? And then just clarity, right? Is your wording intentional? Or do you have like distracting aspects of your writing that undermine the audience's ability to like flow with the writing and not get confused and have to reconstruct what you could mean? Okay, that's what you're gonna be graded on. Those are the expectations. Please feel free to reach out. If you haven't made an appointment already, there still are open slots, or I'm always available via email. So thank you to those who have reached out. This is really great to hear what you're thinking. It's been going really well. Please take advantage of the discussion sections this week. Hopefully you can all be helpful to each other. I think that always goes really well. You're all dealing with the same questions and issues. So good luck making it through the week. I know you have other midterms as well. Please let me know if you're running into any problems. Take care of each other. Bye.